I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
Welcome to Wonderfest presentation of How Attention Affects Perception. My name is Tucker Hyatt. I'm the founding director of Wonderfest, the Bay Area beacon of science. Tonight's Wonderfest speaker is Dr. Michael Silver. He is professor of neuroscience and professor of optometry and vision science at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. Dr. Silver also directs Cal's Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Dr. Silver earned 2 bachelor's degrees a few years ago at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And one of those degrees was in biological sciences and the other in chemistry. He then came west to UCSF where he earned his PhD in neuroscience. In order to prepare this introduction, I visited Dr. Silver's CV, online CV. That's an intimidating document. I navigated through 22 pages, each page having at least 7 references, that is 7 papers that he contributed to or wrote himself. And that's a lot of work. Actually, I said 7, 12 technical works per page, all right? 22 pages, 12 works per page. Dr. Silver is one seriously accomplished researcher in neuroscience, in vision, and with more to come in psychedelics. Please welcome and pay attention to the visionary, Dr. Michael Silver.
Thanks so much, Tucker, for that lovely, gracious introduction and for creating this institution of Wonderfest. It's just spectacular what you've generated in terms of the community and the quality of science and the Sagan Prize. And Tucker occupies a very special place in our family. He was my wife's high school physics teacher back in the day. And she's also participated in Wonderfest. Her name's Jennifer Mitchell. Maybe some of you saw her presentation a couple years ago, maybe?
I think maybe 1.5 almost. Yeah.
And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. I assume most of you are here because you are lifelong learners, but for those of you who are looking to escape the presidential debate, you're welcome too.
It was weird.
Yeah, okay. Surprise, surprise. So the next speaker, Alex Filipenko, will be talking about the universe and the vast extent. And today's talk will be more about the inner universe and how our brain generates our conscious experience of the world around us. So attention is going to be a major theme of this talk, and specifically how attention affects our perception and affects the way we represent objects and patterns in our environment. And I thought maybe we would start by just musing about the different ways in which the word attention is used in common language. So for a given experimental study, attention may have a very well-defined operational definition, but we also use this word in everyday language, and we use it in really quite distinct ways that are all combined into this one word, attention. So for example, something bright caught my attention. This refers to the aspect of attention in which our attention can be captured. So even if we're focused on each other here in this room, if there's a loud sound in the next room or a bright flash somewhere, it will capture our attention, whether we want it to or not, in an involuntary kind of manner. So that's one type of attention, is the kind that is involuntary, that we really don't have control over. I didn't see you, I was paying attention to the game. This refers to a different aspect of attention, where attention is a filter, basically, and it enhances that part of the visual scene that we're attending to at any given time. Our perception is greatly magnified for those objects or locations that we're attending to. And we don't have as well, the quality of our perception is much poorer outside of the locus of our attention. So a metaphor that's often used is that attention is a spotlight that we can move around in the visual field, dissociated from where our eyes are, where our gaze is directed. And wherever we're attending, we're super perceivers there, and we're much worse perceivers at those parts of the visual field that we're not attending to. I struggle to pay attention to the lecture refers to the fact that certain types of attention are effortful and hard work and exhausting. And we actually really, to this day, don't have really any understanding of how that happens in the brain. What's the resource that's limited that we're depleting when we're engaging our attention for long periods of time? But certainly a core fact of our attention systems. And finally, I don't remember even cleaning the table. I must not have been paying attention. This refers to the links between attention and memory, just like attending to a certain location or object enhances our perception of that location or object. It also enhances the encoding of that into memory. And so our memories are much stronger and more robust for aspects of the environment that we're attending to. So one word, it really probably should be many words, but it is used one word, and it refers to these really very different phenomena and different kinds of mechanisms. So now I'll ask all of you to do an attention task. I'm showing a video now of two groups of people, one with white shirts, one with black shirts, and each of them has a ball that they pass to their teammates. And I'd like you to count the number of times that the team with the white shirts passes the ball to each other. Okay, how many times? 13. All right, I think it is 14. I guess first of all, some of you clearly I could see from your reaction you've seen this video before. How many have seen the video before? Okay. Of those that haven't, how many perceived the gorilla in the video? Okay, and the rest of you are probably wondering what is going on here. Why am I talking about a gorilla? And so this is an example of how attention enhances our perception of the attended item and reduces the perception elsewhere. So I'll show you the same video again, but now instead of just focusing on the white shirts, ask you to just open your attention filters, expand your spotlight, and just see the video in an open-ended way. I swear this is the same video that you just saw. So not a subtle visual stimulus, right? A menacing gorilla stopping, turning, beating his chest, and it's invisible. It can be invisible. So for many people who see this for the first time and they're instructed to focus on the white shirts, they're effectively suppressing anything that's black, that's not relevant to accomplishing that task, and that includes a black gorilla that's right in the center of the image that you're looking at. And so this kind of thing happens to us all the time. We usually don't get to rewind reality and play it back to see what we've missed the first time around. But we have this illusion that we are taking in the world around us completely as a video camera does. But in reality, the quality of perception of the high quality perception is a very limited part of what we're exposed to at any given time. And that it needs to be that way, that our brain simply doesn't have the computational ability to process all of the visual field every millisecond at high spatial resolution. And so attention's evolved for us as a way to identify those parts of the visual environment that are most important, relevant, necessary for our survival, and then we have really great perception there, but not elsewhere. So the people that are the masters of directing and manipulating attention are magicians and illusionists. That's a huge part of why magic tricks are effective, is directing your attention to a certain location, and so something else is happening at a location you're not attending to, and you're effectively blind to it. So I'll ask you to now take a look at this card trick. Hopefully the video will be okay.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. And what I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Do a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
Okay, I'll pause there for a second. Not very amazing, right? They took one deck of cards off camera and switched it with another one. Kind of a lame trick, actually. And so what we'll see now is the very same trick, but now from a different perspective, a different camera that was simultaneously recording what was happening. So this is the last frame of the video you just saw. And then we'll transition into the first frame of the video.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. And what I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Do a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
Okay, that's more amazing. I think this is an homage to the video that we just saw.
Oh yeah, good capture.
Okay. I'm going to take you to yet another attention task. What you'll see now is a pair of videos, a pair of images that are alternating back and forth, A, B, A, B, A, B, and see if you can find what the difference between the two images is. How many of you found it? Okay, a few. If I say direct your attention to just below the base of the airplane wing. Then it becomes a lot more obvious. So the images aren't changing at all. What's changed is that you hear my suggestion to direct your attention somewhere, and your attention then lands on the right part of the image, and then it's so obvious you can't unsee it anymore. And you kind of amazing that you didn't notice it before. And again, these kinds of things, these are somewhat selected examples, but these phenomena happen in our everyday experience all the time. And it's interesting that wherever you're attending, it's not as though the rest of the world turns to black or gray. It seems vivid, and our experience of it is that it's available to us, but in an important way it really isn't, so that even something like the appearance and disappearance of an airplane engine can go undetected if you're not attending to the right place. And for those of you that found it, basically your attention kind of by chance almost happened to land on that part of the image, and then you had the same benefits to perception of attention that the rest of us did when we voluntarily directed our attention there. Okay, here's another example, the same kind of thing, and alternating images back and forth. And how many have detected it? Okay, a few. This time I'm going to direct your attention differently. Let me back up a little bit. So instead of using a verbal suggestion that your auditory system is then turning into a location for you to direct your attention to, I will just indicate the direction directly, the location here. And so this is an example of involuntary attention. So me suggesting, why don't you try directing your attention under the airplane wing, you could have disregarded that suggestion, and then you wouldn't have enjoyed the benefits of perception due to attention. But in this case, you really have no choice. Once this high contrast red dot appears on the screen, it involuntarily, automatically captures your attention, but you still get the benefits of attention on perception, and be able to see something that was there for you to see before, but effectively invisible because of where you were attending. So at this point, a lot of people's reactions are, well, you've made these very contrived artificial kinds of situations that involve trickery or some manipulation of images, and it's actually important, I think, for the evolution of our attention systems that we don't really get to peer under the hood so much, and we're not aware of the fact that we're missing so much of the world around us, because it would be really paralyzing and not adaptive for us to constantly be second-guessing our perceptual systems. And so it's important that we do experience the world as though we were cameras, but obviously that's not the case. Yeah, go ahead.
A quick question. Under hypnosis, might one come up with the gorilla or whatever?
I think it's, you mean with hypnosis, that's specifically suggesting to direct your attention elsewhere.
My impression is our mind kind of takes in everything, but we only recollect or see the parts that make sense or that, I mean, you help me here.
So yes is the answer, and there are actually many strategies and techniques for broadening or narrowing your focus of attention, and so hypnosis is one path there for sure. Yeah. So this is a more real-world example. It still is an experimental study, and what you'll see is a person on the University of Illinois campus, and they don't know that they're a participant in the experiment. So for those of you who remember Candid Camera TV show, it's kind of like that, but in a research setting. And so one of the experimenters goes up to this unwitting participant and asks for directions on how to get to a certain campus building. We'll take it from there. So this is our poor, unsuspecting research participant. This is one of the researchers, although he's not introduced himself that way. He's just asking for directions. And then his co-conspirators come by, and they do the old switcheroo. And so this poor guy's talking to a different person now, and has no idea that the person has transformed into another human being. And you might think, okay, maybe they just picked out this example, and the fact is this is a very common phenomenon. So I think we'll see in a second, about half of the subjects in this study did not notice that the person they were talking to instantly turned into another person. And they repeated this experiment in situations, for example, when a college student goes to the registrar's office to submit a form, and the person they're talking to ducks behind a counter, and another person pops up and continues the conversation. And you think there's no way that you wouldn't notice that, but the data suggests otherwise, that we are all more or less in the same boat this way, and our preconceptions guide where we're attending, and we're just not really considering the possibility that the person we're talking to is going to morph into someone else, and so we are blind when that happens, even though it's so shocking and surprising. So all of this is part of a kind of broader theoretical construct in perception research, which is that perception is really something that is constructed by our brain. It's informed, of course, by the light that's entering our eyes, but the idea that our perception is like a camera is very much an illusion. And the metaphor of a camera is excellent for our eyes, the actual eyes themselves. So both cameras and our eyes have pinholes, they have a lens, they have a sheet of light-sensitive material in the back. But once you go beyond the eye and the brain, it is all deviant from what cameras do. And we are using our previous experience and our behavioral goals and our attention to construct inferences, narratives almost, about what's out there in the world. And the goal of our perceptual system that we've acquired through evolution is not to accurately represent all detailed aspects of the world. It's to be useful and to be able to accomplish what we're trying to do in terms of interacting with the world around us. And so many visual illusions basically derive from this mismatch between the light that is actually striking our retinas in the eye and our conscious experience. And the brain takes lots of shortcuts that are very helpful in terms of saving computation that generally are extremely adaptive in most environments, but the illusion is sort of the exception that proves the rule and demonstrates that there can be this mismatch between the actual sensory stimulation and our conscious experience. So here's one example. This you see as craters in the top of mounds, and this you see as mounds at the bottom of craters. They're actually the same image, just flipped with respect to each other. So the image is fundamentally ambiguous. There's not enough information in it to correctly assign depth. But if you unconsciously make the assumption that the light that created this photograph is coming from above as opposed from below, then that disambiguates the image. And if light is coming from above, then the only way that you can get this pattern of shading is if this is convex and this is concave and this is convex. I'm sorry, yeah, this is concave and this is convex. And so this assumption that we make that light's coming from above, that's a very good assumption in almost all the environments that we encounter. And so the brain can use that to add information to this image that's not in the image itself, it's not in our eyes, it's constructed by our brain. And it's a very useful and adaptive aspect of vision to be able to do this. But it also illustrates the fact that perception isn't something that we record, it's something that we build and construct in our brain. Here's another example. If you look at this, you perceive it as a checkerboard surface with a cylinder, and the cylinder casting a shadow here. And if you measure the brightness of square A and square B using a photometer, you would find that they have exactly the same brightness. But we don't perceive it that way. And so in some ways, it's an illusion where our brain is getting the wrong answer, that these in fact do have the same luminance, the same brightness, but we fail to record that fact about the environment. But in a deeper way, our perception is getting it right. We are interpreting these squares as not isolated squares, but rather it's part of the surface. We're looking at this pattern of shading and inferring that the light is coming from above and to the right, making this three-dimensional structure cast a shadow on here. And ultimately, what we would like to know as perceiving organisms is not the actual physical luminance of the environment, but what are the materials of the objects in the world around us, what are their identities? And so if we think about, well, what's the true color of pigment or paint, if this were an actual physical object, the only way this could have the same luminance as this is if it's actually a lighter shade of paint, because it's in shadow and this one's not in shadow. So our brain is doing all of these computations and inferences to be able to get at the reality independent of the illumination conditions. And so this is easily demonstrated if you just take away this contextual information, sort of isolate these squares. And so this is now the same image with just adding these two gray bars, so that disrupts the surface perception. And now you see A and B as having the same luminance, which they actually do have, but they have the same luminance here as well. But we are essentially accounting for the particularities of the shadow and the luminance and so forth to be able to get at the more stable, true reality of the situation. And that's another active, constructed part of our perception. We don't want a situation where we're looking at something and the sun goes behind a cloud and it appears to be something else. We know that it's the same object, even though the light reflecting from it is now very different. And so our brain takes that into account and is able to sort of discard the particularities of the luminance to be able to give us more stable perception. Another way that we are actively constructing our perception is being able to have a coherent and stable perception while our eyes are moving around the visual scene. So we move our eyes about 3 times a second. Every time we do that, we get a completely different image on our retina. And somehow, we don't experience any discontinuities when we move our eyes around in this way. But if you would imagine putting a camera, a micro camera at the very back of your retina and central vision, that's actually simulated here. So this is what that camera would see, just looking out at a very small part of where the gaze is directed. And this is an image that someone is exploring with their eyes, moving around, looking at different parts of it. This circle indicates the direction of their gaze. So as the person moves their eyes around in a very normal exploratory pattern, this is what the central retina has to deal with. But our perception, when we do this, is stable, and it looks like the overall image. But the actual input to the brain is this. So somehow our brain's able to stitch together these snapshots of a few hundred milliseconds at a time of completely different parts of the scene and put it all together to give us this immersive, in a sense, illusory reconstruction of the world around us. And so we do this all the time without even thinking about it. And so, but you can yourself experience the power of this ability for the visual system to sew these together by simply closing one eye or winking. Sorry, go ahead.
Is that the same phenomenon if you're given a sentence that isn't properly spelled out, you can still read it, even just with a few letters?
I would say it's related. So we're taking into account all the words and letters we've read in our entire life, and there's certain patterns that are more regularly occurring than others. And so even if the visual input's not quite ideal, we have enough of a clue that we can then make that inferential leap with our previous experience to be able to see it as a word, even though it's not that way.
Fascinating, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so another related example is the number of cells in our retina that project back into our brain is about 1 million.
Wow.
So it's a lot of cells, but in terms of spatial resolution, that's like your iPhone 1. It's like a 1 megapixel resolution, which these days is considered terrible for cameras. So that's what we have as humans, is a 1 megapixel resolution. The rest of it that we perceive in such incredible detail is mostly inferred and extrapolated from this very low resolution image that we actually get from our eyes. And then for eye movements, if you either cover one eye or wink and then just gently move your eye in its orbit through the eyelid, just slightly depress your eye. If you do that, you'll see that the world moves. Every time you displace your eye just a little bit, you experience that as the world moving. But if you make an eye movement, the natural eye movement from one location to another, it's a much bigger displacement of the retinal image, but that doesn't seem like the world moving. And the reconciliation of that is that when we do make an eye movement, those parts of the brain that plan and execute the eye movement send information to the more sensory parts of our brain and kind of give us a heads up that the eyes are about to move 10 degrees to the left and 8 degrees up. And that informs this procedure of stitching the retinal images together because the exact trajectory of the eye movement is known in advance. Whereas if you're just displacing your eye with your finger, no one told your visual cortex that the eye is moving, and so we then interpret that as, well, the only way that you could get that kind of displacement of the image on the retina is if it were out there in the world. So we make the inference there that there's some external motion because the normal process of correcting for our internal eye movements is not operational. So these are all fascinating perceptual phenomena, and I think have a lot to teach us about our own consciousness and the way that we experience the world. But a big part of my own interest in my lab's research is trying to understand the fundamental mechanisms of this at the level of the brain. So how can we understand how factors such as attention or expectation or previous knowledge shape our perceptual representations to create this actively constructed percept of the world. So I'll spend a little time talking about the key structures that are involved in this, and I'll say from the outset, like, we still know depressingly little about these phenomena at the level of the brain, but we have some clues. And so just focusing on the visual system here, this is a side view of the brain, of course. These are the eyes looking out at the image. The retina is at the back of the eye. That's where our photoreceptors are that are turning light into electrical activity. That electrical activity is propagated back through our optic nerves to a structure called the LGN, or lateral geniculate nucleus, deep within the brain. And then there are synapses there that is a chemical signal from the retinal cells to the LGN cells. And then those LGN cells project very long connections to the visual cortex in the back of the brain. So it's curious that almost any intuition you might have about how the visual system should be wired up if you were designing a visual system from scratch, evolution has chosen something completely different and counterintuitive. So one of them is that of course the brain's covered by a thin sheet of cells called the cerebral cortex, and the first part of the visual cortex, you might think, well, I would put that next to the eyes, and I put the auditory cortex next to the ears, but it's as far back from the eyes as you can get. It's the very, very back of the brain is where our initial visual cortical processing happens. Yes?
I've heard that the eye evolved several different times in life's processes on Earth. If that's true, how about where does that variation stop? Is the electronic part beyond the, let's say it's different up until the neurons, and then it's all similar going back yet even different kind of brain structures?
Brains are dramatically different across all the different species that have eyes, but the fundamental structure of the eye is also very different. So for example, in humans and all mammals and even further related species, the blood vessels that supply oxygen to our retina are in front of the light detecting cells. Seems like another crazy way to design the system. But invertebrates, for example, octopuses, they have the opposite. They have the light detecting cells in front and then the vessels in back. And so those are examples of independent evolution of eyes. So all eyes were thought to start as just a sheet of light-sensitive material on the outside of the animal, basically. And then optically, it's way better to have that light-sensitive material protected in a chamber, just like a camera has it. And so that invaginates over time in evolution. But it is true that the eyes, so there's certain principles of the eye that are conserved or, let's say, discovered multiple times, such as having proteins that absorb light and convert that into electrical signals. But even very fundamental kind of structural aspects of the eye is not necessarily the same across species, and in the brains, it's just all over the place, how the problems of perception are solved by different species' brains.
Thank you.
Here's a view of the human brain from below now. So this is the part of the brain that would go down to the spinal cord, coming out of the plane of the projection screen. So we've got both of our eyes here now. You can see the optic nerves. They join together in the optic chiasm. Interestingly, some of these axons cross and go into the opposite hemisphere, and other axons stay on the same side. But all the retinal axons, the connections from the retinal cells, end up in these LGN structures on both sides of the brain. And then those LGN structures go back to the primary visual cortex, simply because it's the first visual cortical area in these visual pathways at the very back of the brain. And this shows in a little more detail that these projections that bring information from the environment into our brain. And what you can see here is now if this person, if they had an intact brain and they're looking straight ahead at this location, some parts of the visual environment are to the right of their gaze, called the right visual field. Some are in the left visual field, to the left of their gaze. And so different locations in the visual field will illuminate different parts of the retina. So the left visual field will illuminate the right side of the retina, shown here in red, on both eyes. the right visual field locations will illuminate the left side of the retina in both eyes. And here you can see some of these axons crossing at the optic chiasm, some staying on the same side. And the upshot of all this is that we have what's called a contralateral representation of visual space. Contra meaning against, lateral meaning side. So all locations in the left visual field to the left of our gaze are represented in the right hemisphere. All those locations in the right visual field are represented in the left hemisphere. Again, counterintuitive. Why are we flipping the left and right of the visual field representation in our brain, and why do we have these axons that start here but then cross all the way over to the other side of the brain? Nobody really knows. This is something that evolved extremely early in the development of body plans in organisms, and it's true for the motor system, for the auditory system, the somatosensory system. It's a very general principle. Yes?
Are you working on that yourself?
We are recording from different areas in the visual system, so those experiments are informed by our knowledge of the basic anatomy of it. Yeah. And so one consequence of this is adjacent locations in the visual field will illuminate adjacent locations in the retina. And then, so the retina essentially has a map of the world, just like the light-sensitive material in a camera film in the old days and a digital array now. And that map of the retina is replicated over and over and over again in the brain. So each of these LGN structures has a map of the contralateral visual field. So the right LGN has a continuous map of all of the objects, features, colors in the contralateral left visual field, and that gets passed on to another map in the primary visual cortex. And the same for the left hemisphere. It's representing locations in the right visual field in a way that is continuous. And so how did we learn this fact about the visual system? This goes back to more than a century now. And three of the characters who played important roles in this, in retrospect, are these three guys who were basically weapons developers and inventors. So they were involved in either developing rifles or bullets, and the consequences of their work were that the speed of bullets as they left rifles was greatly increased. So this is a map of muzzle velocity of bullets over time, and before these inventions, the values were a few hundred, and then afterwards they jumped up to nearly 1,000 meters per second. And what that meant for vision science is now, instead of the bullets going slowly and striking soldiers in the head and essentially getting stopped by the tissue and making messy injuries, now the bullets were going fast enough they would often travel through the head and cauterize the wound as they went. So they made much more precise injuries. And I don't think that was necessarily the intention, but it turned out to be very informative for vision science, and particularly a scientist and physician who worked for the Japanese government during the Russo-Japanese War, shown here, Tetsuji Inoue. His job was to characterize how much of the visual field was damaged for soldiers who had suffered bullet wounds in the visual part of their brain. And the Japanese system at that time awarded greater pensions to soldiers that had greater visual field loss. And so his job was to report to the military part of the government how much visual field loss an injured soldier had. But being a great scientist, in addition to a physician, he correlated the amount of visual field loss and where in the visual field the loss took place. He correlated that with the trajectory of the bullet through the brain. And through that derived the first one-to-one mapping between representational locations in the world and representations in primary visual cortex, and that's how we first knew that primary visual cortex actually has a map of the visual field called a retinotopic map because it comes from the retina. Yes?
Does any of this have to do with eye dominance? For example, I was taking a lesson on shooting a bow and arrow, and I'm left-handed, and I would shoot lefty, but the instructor checked my eye, he says I'm right eye dominant. So if I shot right-handed, I would probably be more accurate. Is that a thing, or how's that determined?
It is a factor. The basic anatomy, though, is pretty invariant to that. So if we, for example, if there's a target in the left visual field, for example, that is illuminating the right part of the retina in both eyes, and this is where the crossing becomes relevant. So the left eyes, the right side of the left retina is going to send its axons to cross, but the right eye is going to keep those axons on the same side. And so by the time you get to the LGN and beyond, these are now representing the signals from both eyes, and the retinotopic maps are actually superimposed on each other. So eye dominance is really a thing, handedness is definitely really a thing, and it does influence behavior and performance, but these basic structures are combining the eyes at a very early stage, and that's actually part of why we have stereoscopic depth perception. So what we see when we wear goggles in 3D movies, for example, is taking advantage of the fact that the eyes have very similar but slightly different images of the world, and that varies as a function of depth. And so those signals get combined very early on, so we're already computing depth information here in a way that is not differentiating between the two eyes. Okay, so this work was done the early 1900s. These days we use techniques such as fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to map retinotopic areas in the human brain. But the basic concept is the same. We are correlating locations in the world, in this case not damage to the brain, but rather what parts of the brain are activated when a stimulus is shown at a certain location. And so what you're seeing here is a magnetic resonance image of the structural aspects of the brain, and then superimposed on that you're seeing functional activation. So you show a spot of light in some location in the visual field, and you ask what part of the visual cortex is activated by that spot of light, and then you move the spot of light to different locations. So this is a cartoon of what the participant would see in this experiment. So this would be in front of the person's face, of course, and then this is superimposed on a brain image of that same person, this being the back of the brain, where the primary visual cortex is. The arrow shows what stimulus is being shown at any given time. So I'm going to show you a movie now where the stimulus is starting at the center of gaze here, and it's moving further and further out into the peripheral vision. And what you'll see is that as that stimulus goes out into the visual field, the part of the brain that it activates systematically moves across the brain, consistent with there being a continuous map of the visual field in the brain. So the arrow is showing you what stimulus is being presented at any given time. That goes by quickly, so let me play that again.
Are you controlling for eye movement when you do this?
Yeah, in the purest form of the person needs to maintain fixation the entire time. That's an important insight. So if you were to move your eyes, then the image would fall in a different part of the retina and be routed to a different part of the retinotopic map.
So this is not just tracking eye movement, it's
No.
location.
In fact, if you perfectly follow the stimulus location with your eyes, it would continuously activate the same location. Yeah, exactly. So using these kinds of techniques, we've discovered as a scientific community multiple brain areas. Each of these has a map of the visual field. So what you're seeing here is, again, the back of the brain, and now imagine taking the two parts of the brain and pulling them apart, just like two halves of a walnut, and you're looking at the inner surface here, so corresponding to the dotted region here. And you can see V1 is just another name for primary visual cortex, shown here in blue. But there are other areas that are right next to it that actually tile the surface of the cerebral cortex that are unimaginatively given names like V2, V3, V4, etc., which is unfortunate. Part of the fun of neuroanatomy is the structures that were discovered a long time ago had really creative and imaginative names, but no longer. I've heard people say it's a good thing cloud types were defined when they were, because we have great names like cumulonimbus and stratus and cirrus, and if it were now it'd be like cloud type 1A and type 1B and whatnot. So neuroscience is young enough that we have these boring names, but it's interesting that the brain has so many maps of the visual field. There's actually dozens of maps, and they all have this contralateral organization where, this being the left hemisphere, each of these maps is a full map of the opposite right visual field. And each of these areas has those locations mapped over and over again. So one of the really exciting directions in the field is to try to understand why we have so many areas, and what are the unique contributions of each of these areas to our conscious perception of the world around us. But it's also a curiosity that there's no blank space between these maps. So they continuously tile the cortex. And so as the field progresses and we discover more and more of these areas, it's, you know, kind of like, here there be dragons. We don't really know the structure of these, but with each passing year, basically we discover new areas that add to this tiling and help us to more objectively define the functional organization of the visual system. So now coming all the way back to attention, what we really like to understand is what's the difference between the gorilla that's striking your retina when you're attending to it and you're having a conscious experience of it versus when you're not attending to it and it's still hitting your retina, it's getting to your visual system, but you have no conscious awareness of it. And so these kinds of questions are operationalized in as simple a way as possible to have as much experimental control as possible. So in this experiment, if you were a participant, you'd be maintaining your gaze here, fixating on this point, and then you're directing your attention either to these stripes on the right side, the right visual field, or on the left side. And the yellow circle is just for us. So if you were a participant in the study, you wouldn't see the yellow circle. It's just telling us where the subject is attending. And the cue to attend is just this white line, slightly displaces. So if the white line is jutting out to the right, that means you should direct your attention without moving your eyes to the stimulus on the right. And if it juts to the left, then you switch your attention over here. So attention is going to be bouncing back and forth between these stimuli. Importantly, the stimuli don't change at all. They're continuous, and the only thing that's changing is whether you're attending to the left one and ignoring the right one, or attending to the right one and ignoring the left one. And then what we see here is the primary visual cortex of the participant, with red indicating areas of increased brain activation during this task. So if you look at this for a while, it's just on loop. When the subject is attending to the left, there's more activity in the contralateral opposite right visual cortex. And when they're attending to the right, there's more activity in the contralateral left visual cortex. So even at this very early stage of the visual system, the strength of the response of the brain to a stimulus depends on whether it's being attended or ignored. And so this is a plausible mechanism for the kinds of phenomena that we saw, like the card trick and the gorilla. We are actually getting a bigger boost in brain response to a stimulus when we're attending to it. Yeah.
If the perceptions of different halves of the visual field happen on opposite sides of the brain, then surely each half of the brain pays attention independently. You have one point of attention over here, one point of attention over here, correct?
They're anatomically separated, but they're highly interconnected, and I think it's just evolution has to work within this ancient framework of bilateral symmetry, and so they have to be separated for that reason. But functionally, you can think of it as just two halves of the same unit, and certainly when a stimulus moves across our visual field, crossing from right to left, it is the representation that is jumping from one hemisphere to another, but we just patch it effortlessly with all these inferential mechanisms. So they're not independent, they're not completely continuous either, though. There are phenomena, for example, if you're tracking multiple objects moving around, you can do that better if they're confined to one hemifield or the other versus another configuration across the hemifields. So your intuition has some like counterpart in the brain, but for the most part, it's just an artifact of evolution that they're separated.
But where did the bifurcation on our own evolution start? And I know mammals, I suppose, are bifurcated that way. Where did we kind of start? And are there many other animals that don't have it two sides or bifurcated?
Oh my goodness. I mean, even flatworms have bilateral symmetry.
Okay.
So it goes back
That
to
answers it.
what,
Yes. Good. Thank you.
primitive's not the right word, very early invertebrates.
Very early, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I think he has his hand up.
Okay, thanks. Please.
What about instances of traumatic brain injury where the hemispheres have been split somehow, like don't know, phase gauge, people like that. Does something just disappear when it moves across the visual field, or?
It's fascinating. So there's multiple.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, sure. What happens if the connections between the hemispheres are severed? It turns out there's multiple connections, and so I don't think there's any case where all of them have been completely severed. But there were cases with people with extreme epilepsy where the epileptic seizure would start on one part of the brain and propagate over the entire brain. And so in an attempt to keep it somewhat contained, surgeons actually cut the corpus callosum, one of the major connections between the two hemispheres. And it wasn't as simple as that the two hemispheres weren't communicating with each other anymore, but more at a higher cognitive level. There was a dissociation between the kind of physical experience of what's out there in the world and maybe the emotional content in some cases. And so these participants would have a dissociation between, they would see a stimulus briefly shown to one of their hemispheres, which had a lot of kind of emotional content in it. And they would have an emotional reaction, but they didn't have any insight as to why, because those higher level structures in the brain weren't in communication with each other. There are other people with brain injuries that completely wipe out one hemisphere, or maybe the connections from the LGN to the cortex. And they have a phenomenon called blind sight, which is incredible. They have some residual vision, but they don't have any conscious appreciation of their abilities. So as far as they're concerned, they're blind. And so if you had blind sight in your left visual field, and I said, how many fingers am I holding up? And you say, what are you talking about? I didn't even know you were holding up fingers. But if I force you to make a guess, you'll actually be above chance performance. And so there's a dissociation there between this construction of the environment and the phenomenal consciousness that goes along with it. That's a consequence of unilateral damage to these early visual cortical areas.
Do they have reflexes too?
Yeah, and they can even navigate. I mean, there's a variety of different levels, but in the extreme version, you can have measurable visual capacity without any awareness that you've got. You just, as far as you know, you're completely blind there. And you don't really have an explanation for why you're not running into obstacles in that part of your visual field. Yes.
Is there an average age of your participants? And if so, would there be a difference? So I've noticed that this one, for example, was done in 1999. If you were to do the same exact procedure or experiment, what have you, would it be the same as it was in 99 as it is in 2024? So
Meaning
first
that
question, age of participants.
Yeah. And a very basic finding like this, which is that the response to an intended stimulus is greater than the response to an unintended stimulus, that's very robust across people of all ages. There are certainly aspects of vision that change in the brain over time. And obviously our eyes change too. We all become presbyopic, farsighted, but there's changes in the brain that are systematic, that are the subject of a lot of research. But these kind of fundamental effects of attention on perception they start at a very young age in development, and they're really there through the lifespan.
Quick question here. Yeah, I love these brain studies now. I know left and right brain is not simplistic like people say, but basically one of the brain researchers, I was reading something, maybe you can say more about it, and this person, it was severed, is what, mainly. And basically, the left brain supposedly can understand language or whatever, and the right brain, you'd have to have symbols or something because it can't just speak that way. So he asked the left brain, kind of a crazy question, is there life after death? And the left brain said, of course not, that's absurd, logical, whatever. Then he asked the right brain, and he said, of course it is, so what do you, crazy.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, are you familiar with that study?
Yeah, I mean, it's like many dichotomies, it's an oversimplification, but
exactly.
there also is different specialization in the two hemispheres. There's no doubt about that. Yes?
The images up there, left and right visual fields, they're symmetric to each other, but the brain response, those red areas are not.
Yeah.
So is that just individual random differences in assemblies of axons?
Yeah, it's even probably more basic than that, which is that we're just looking at a single slice through a cortical map that is just one small portion of the cortical map that's both in front of the screen and behind the screen, and so just the plane of section just happens to cut through the two hemispheres in slightly different ways. So if you reconstructed the full map, it would seem a lot more symmetric, and in fact there is every single location that we can see in the left visual field has a counterpart in the visual maps in our right hemisphere somewhere.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Just one. We go back to the neurons that you mentioned. How in the beginning that the signals from the right eye go. There are neurons that go mostly. Was it mostly to the left side of the brain? But there are also they also go to the same side. So what are the function of the ones that go to the same side? I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, the ones that go to the same side are on the temporal parts of our eyes. So call that just because it's close to the temples, which is an aside, but the word temples thought to come from the fact that that's where you go gray earliest. So it's where the passage of time reveals itself. But so it just has to do with the location in the retina. So those that are nasal, close to the nose, they're the ones that cross. The ones that are on the lateral side of their head, those stay on the same side. And what that enables the brain to do is to combine information from the two eyes in the same brain structure early on.
Just one other thing that occurs to me. Can anything of value be discerned from experiments potentially on individuals that have some kind of structural damage just to the eye, not to the brain? The brain's intact, but for some reason, maybe since birth, maybe not.
Absolutely.
They only have one functional. If the other eye is not functional, not sending any signals at all. So what is that consistent with what you would expect? Would you see that?
So from before birth, one eye, the neurons in one eye are not operational.
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, there's no possibility for depth perception because you need a comparison between the two eyes. There's limited visual field because the nose actually is an occluder. So an object over here, I can see it with my right eye, but I can't see it with my left eye because the nose is in the way. But fundamentally, that person can have pretty normal vision because of this property where each of these cortical areas is receiving input from both eyes, but it has the visual field map is not based on one eye or the other. And so, you can imagine just covering one of your eyes, your vision is still intact. And so that's also the case if you go through life with just one intact eye.
So there have been patients that have that have been studied.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think from a research perspective, there's more focus on changes in the eye well after birth. So for example, people with macular degeneration, they're losing the neurons in the very center of both of their retinas. And it can be very disabling, but it's a very vivid illustration of these concepts of the brain being an active, constructive component of perception, because those people can have hallucinations. So they have no functional vision in their central vision, but they can use their memories, and the brain is so kind of starved for signals to be able to make inferences about. It will replace the sensory input with its own information, and people can have very vivid hallucinations of entire landscapes and buildings and so forth, and it's totally constructed by these inferential systems that have been kind of unleashed in the brain through the retinal degeneration. Tucker, let me check in with you about time. I've got plenty of time, but is there a time that I should aim to stop by?
Maybe 15 or 20 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so this just gives you a sense of what neuroscience is up against to try to make sense of all of this. Here's our retinal cells. And this is from a monkey, I should say, not a human. But here's the LGN cells, here's the primary visual cortex, and here's all the rest of the parts of the brain that have some role in visual perception. So all of these active processes involving attention and behavioral goals, etc., these are represented in all of these different structures that are highly interconnected with areas at many different stages of the visual pathways. And this is true in the human as well. So I mentioned how we're collectively finding more and more of these visual areas over time. Each of these colored squares represents a distinct identified brain area that has a full map of the visual field, and you can see again how they tile the surface of the cortex. So one of the things that we would like to understand is not just, I showed you an example of how attention affects the brain's response to a stimulus, but where is the actual signal for attention in the brain? When we make a decision to attend to a location, how is that manifested in the brain? And so to look at that, just say a little bit about the structure of the cerebral cortex. So this is a tissue section on a microscope slide through a human brain. Here you see what's called the gray matter, which is gray and unstained tissue, but this tissue's been stained. And so each of the colored bands here is a different layer of cortical neurons. And then all of this underneath is the white matter. These are all axons that are connecting different parts of the cortical surface to each other. And so if you inflate the cortical surface, it's roughly the size of a small pizza for the human brain. So it's very convoluted, and that actually helps there to pack more cortical surface into a relatively small three-dimensional structure. And if we didn't have that convolution, our heads would be enormous. And it's just a thicket of connectivity in the cortex. So we've got about 100,000 cells in each cubic millimeter, and 3 kilometers of axon branches. So take a cubic millimeter of cortex, separate out all the axon branches, lay them end to end, and a couple of miles of axons.
One quick question. My brother is losing his white matter in his brain, and basically also, I may have mentioned that his REM sleep, he doesn't sleep enough, and so his daydreams are becoming like vivid dreams, and it seems like the subconscious negativity is coming out, and it seems real about his relatives, and all these people are nice to him, and he thinks all of them are stealing and robbing him and being terrible. Did you say anything about all that?
I mean, it's probably a form of dementia, if
Yes,
it's a
it is.
neurological kind of diagnosis, but why it particularly manifests that way, I really don't think anyone in the field knows at this point.
But the white matter also helps you with decisions and orienting progress, does it?
Yeah, white matter's everything that involves communication between areas in the cortex, so
Okay.
it underlies almost every mental function and emotional function. Yeah. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think I'll skip some of these slides and just cut to the chase. This is a summary of a study we did some years ago where we actually did discover 2 new areas. Also gave them boring names based on their location in the brain, the intraparietal sulcus 1 and 2. So this is actually the arrangement of visual cortical areas in my own brain, looking at it from the left side. So. And these areas hadn't previously been discovered, in part because the techniques used to map out these earlier areas simply involved looking at visual stimuli and measuring the brain's response to those stimuli. There was no requirement for attention on the part of the participant. They were just passively viewing the stimuli. And we introduced a task where we were systematically manipulating the location of the spotlight of attention. And it revealed these 2 new structures that seemed to be involved in transmitting attention signals back to these early visual areas to be able to boost those parts of the visual map that correspond to the attended location. So these areas effectively have a map of the visual field, but it's really a map of where you're attending more than anything that refers to the outside world. And so this is somehow translating our goals at any given time, which are very abstract. My goal might be to reach for my glass, but in terms of visual cortex, what I want to do is activate that part of the map that corresponds to that location. And so these areas maybe are involved in translating these extremely abstract goals on the part of people into visual coordinates to be able to boost processing of attended locations, to be able to make us more efficient in our movements and our decisions. And so having identified these areas, so we can identify them in every person. So each of you could be a participant in the study. Your particular V1, IPS1 might have a slightly different shape or location or size, but we can determine where it is in your brain and then record the time course of activity while you're performing different kinds of attention or perception tasks, and then look at the relationships between these time series and start building a circuit diagram of how information flows through these different areas to ultimately result in enhanced perception at attended locations. And so this is an early stab at this. Arrows indicate unidirectional flow of information from these areas that have these maps of attention. You can see these signals are flowing out of these areas into these early visual cortical areas.
Question.
Yes?
So when you've been talking about attention, you've been talking about it in terms of spatial location. And that's just one aspect of attention, obviously.
Yes.
Are you looking at other aspects of attention besides location?
Yeah, that's another very insightful point. Spatial attention is much more widely studied, and we're much further along in understanding it, and it's because of these maps of the visual field in the brain. These are relatively large on the structure of neuroscience. And so, for example, you can have attention over here versus over here, and you get completely separate portions of the brain that are enhanced or suppressed. Attention to things like objects or motion or features or colors, neurons that code those dimensions of the world are much more intermixed with each other. So at the sub-millimeter scale, you've got neurons that represent all possible edge angles, for example, or all possible colors. And so we just don't have the resolution to be able to then independently record from those populations of neurons. So that kind of attention is arguably more important than spatial attention in our everyday life, but just the way that the brain is structured, the spatial signals are macroscopically represented, and the features are more microscopically represented, and we just don't have the tools to be able to study them properly. But so people do study them, and also in animals, you can record with microelectrodes from single individual neurons. There, you don't have the same issues about the spatial scale, but spatial attention for sure. Just and now it's like there's so much more known about spatial attention that the questions you can ask about it are far more interesting, and so that alone makes it a target of research. But that's fundamentally it's just the different spatial scales. Okay, so I'll finish with just one really fascinating disorder of attention, and this is also a consequence of brain injury, often followed by a result of stroke. So this is called spatial neglect, and at first glance, it looks, again, like blindness that's located to one part of the visual field. So this is usually after right hemisphere damage, so it affects vision in the left visual field. And people's conscious experience is often that they can't see in the left visual field. But if you make the visual environment extremely simple, then you see that vision's actually intact in the left visual field. So there's not some sort of disconnection of the eyes from the rest of the brain. Rather, there's a deficiency in people's ability to direct attention to the left side of the visual field. And so the classic neurological exam is you ask participants to indicate if your finger's in the left or the right. And if you just do one finger at a time, they can see both fine. But if you do both together, they will only see the one on their right visual field. So that's why it's called neglect. They neglect the events, objects, motion in the left visual field. If there's enough complexity in the environment that you need to allocate your attention to some portion of it, you simply can't direct your attention from the right to the left side of the visual field. So for that reason, it's not a form of blindness. It's actually a deficit in attention, and the benefits of attention on perception just aren't realized in the left visual field. So some of the classic ways to document spatial neglect is if you show people this image and ask them to copy it using pencil and paper, they will accurately recreate the right side of the image and completely neglect the left side. This is a series of self-portraits from an artist who was very accomplished before suffering the stroke that gave him spatial neglect. And this is the progression of his recovery. You can see there's a lot more detail in the later portraits, but also you can see there's this left-right asymmetry where he's got much more accurate representations in the right visual field, or the right side of the portrait versus the left. And you can look at this using more quantitative measures. You can give people paper, this is kind of classic neuropsychological testing, and say, circle all the A's, and they will identify correctly all the A's on the right side, but neglect and fail to detect the ones on the left side. So people with neglect, classically, if they're eating a plate of food, for example, they'll only eat food on the right side. The food will still be on the left side of the plate, but they just don't know it, and if they are distracted and someone turns the plate around, then all of a sudden there's food that they didn't realize they had.
So this is neglect of the left side of the world, not the left visual field, because they can move their eyes around.
So it can be both. It can be tied to the eye, but it can also be much more abstract. So I don't have the images here, but you can show more complex stimuli. For example, a branching structure, which has many branches, and so if people try to draw that, they draw just the right branches and not the left. But if it's now a single stem that bifurcates, and so you've got a region of branches here and a region of branches here, they'll show neglect on the left side of both of those, even though they're correctly perceiving stimuli that are to the left of the neglected. So it can be object-centered, or it can be retinal-centered, or it can be tied to the head, and it just actually gives us a lot of insight into the different spatial coordinate transformations that the brain makes to go from retina to making limb movements or eye movements to different parts of the world. So the simplest version of it is just tied to the retina, but it just depends where the damage in the brain is. Yes?
Does this get better over time, or is there any treatment for it, or are you just stuck with it?
It often does get better over time, but for some people it does not, and it's not known what makes someone a good candidate. My father-in-law actually had neglect after surgery for a meningioma. He never got better. He intellectually understood very well that he had this deficit, and everyone in the family knew. The kids would know, stand on grandpa's right side, not his bad side. And some of the strategies have to do with scanning the environment with your eyes differently. It depends on what stage of the spatial representation is affected. But if you have one good side of the visual field, for example, and you sweep that across the environment you're in, you're going to have a more accurate representation of the entire environment. But there's a part of it that's very resistant. For those people that don't spontaneously recover, even though they know all these strategies and they have insight into their condition, there's some part of it that they just never adapt to, and they still will bump into objects on the left side. They'll still neglect to eat food on the left side, and it's probably just that the attention system is very ancient, and so our more higher level cognitive control is much more recent, and it's just a limited amount of penetration that we have into some of these attention systems. And so when they break, there's only so much you can do to sort of rationally get your way out of it.
Well, how does the brain synchronize light and sound? I know that light is what's quicker and sound is slower, and which one does it affect? Does it average it, or does it focus on except one?
You're not asking about neglect patients, just in general.
No, in general terms.
Yeah.
I've heard that our brain, because light and sound, like off at a distance, the light and the sound, our brain will kind of make it so it seems like one thing rather than two.
Yeah, this is another aspect of how we make an illusory construction. The fact is our eyes are delayed a lot compared to our ears. We don't experience it that way. When you watch a television or go to a concert and the speakers are way over here, but the visual aspect of it is in a completely different location, we effortlessly take the sound and
we sync it, yes.
Impose it on that visual location. So there are very sophisticated mechanisms in the brain to both spatially do that and then also to correct for the temporal offset. Now, if it's a temporal offset is large enough, we can't do it. So lightning in the distance, for example, right? You see that, and then seconds later, it's the sound. But up to a point, we will actually, like lightning in mid-range, we actually perceive it as synchronous, even though it's absolutely not.
Thank you.
So just quickly close talking about these different frames of reference and how neglect is really an attention system. This is a classic experiment done with neglect patients in Milan, Italy. This is an image of the cathedral in the main square. And these people were in their neurologist's office and asked, so they'd grown up in Milan, they knew the city very well. They were asked to imagine standing at the south end of the square, facing this direction. So they're just in a featureless room, but they're remembering the locations and asked, what do you see in your mind's eye when you imagine standing here? And they show neglect for this internal representation. So they're able to name all the shops and restaurants on the right side, but fail to do that on the neglected side. And moments later, if you ask them to imagine standing at the other end of the square, now they can't access the ones that they just named, and they're able to retain the ones. So even in this visual imagery, completely internally generated, these attention systems operate in that domain as well. And so people with neglect actually have neglect for mental imagery as well.
So people with visual neglect on the left, they also neglect auditory signals on the left? Or does it depend where the brain damage is?
So the auditory system is not as well lateralized in that way. So it's not the case that the right hemisphere represents all left locations, and in fact there's very high resolution comparison of the two ear signals. So there is a little bit of an effect, but it's just, given the wiring of the auditory system, it's not impaired in the same way as it is for the visual system, whereas it's a really, really strong lateralization. So I'll just stop by saying, Tucker alluded to this, but an exciting new endeavor at Berkeley campus is the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. So we're just getting into the research there, but it's started a few years ago, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to check out our website, and certainly happy to take questions about that. Possibly I'll come back another day to talk about that research. And this is our lab members who did all the work. Thank you for your attention.
You mind some more questions?
I don't know. So whatever your convention is, I've got time.
All right, let's please, way in the back there, yes.
You know, just to get the big picture down, like what's happening, you know, for example, playing pickleball, everything happens fast, it comes out, you swing, and you think you're hitting it, but it just goes right past you. Is that like, I'm still trying to understand that, but
well,
for attention important, like how, you know, the time available to focus on something.
Attention is a component of that for sure, and your mishits are probably a lapse of attention or a misallocation of attention to a different location. Some of them is probably, you know, noise and variability in your motor system, but a big component of it is attention. There's no doubt about that. And I didn't really get into it, but some of the applications of this attention research is to make people more effective at various kinds of tasks. So you can imagine, you know, people who are luggage screeners in airports, for example, like when they start out, they have an idea of what different kinds of threats look like, but they're really not very good at detecting them in the noisy images that they have to work with. And then over time, they are essentially refining their attention filters to be able to match those particular shapes or patterns, and they become much more effective. So that is a fact of almost all the skills that we learn, is optimizing our attention to be able to select those subcomponents of whatever it is we're attending to kind of extract the most meaningful information as quickly as possible. Yes?
The gorilla.
Sorry,
go ahead, sorry.
Going back to the gorilla thing.
Should I bring it up or?
Well, it recurs to me that I watch a lot of Law and Order type shows. That when people that testify in court and they say this is what they saw and what they didn't see. Have you ever been asked to testify in court about how people can be tricked like that, or by showing these kinds of things that's not what they really saw? How valid is their testimony if we didn't see the gorilla walking through the room?
Yeah, so to answer your question, I there are other colleagues of mine that are more focused on vision in more naturalistic environments that would be more qualified to speak in that kind of setting. But the fact is, our memory is extremely imperfect, and we take the same kind of shortcuts with recollection that we do for perception. And so if we have partial information, we'll fill in the gaps without realizing that we're filling in the gaps. And so there's these really disturbing examples where you can kind of implant stories into people's childhood memories, and they will elaborate as though, and their experience is that it actually happened to them. And it's, the experiment's set up in a way that it's very clear that they never could have experienced that. So this is an issue with courtroom testimony for sure, meeting the witness and so forth. And again, I think we've evolved to be blissfully unaware of how imperfect our memory is this way, because it would be so debilitating to just constantly be sort of reevaluating our performance that way. But I think all of the kinds of very adaptive procedures that the brain uses to make a full picture out of very impoverished information, those mechanisms occur with memory and recollection too, at all ages.
A gorilla question. Indigenous cultures, other cultures, like, we don't see the gorilla and we see certain things. Other cultures, their whole culture and everything may cause them to see certain other things and not other things.
Definitely, yeah. Even if you're at a party and there's a dozen conversations that you can hear, if someone says your name, that's going to pop out, and it's because you've got a very specialized representation of that. So for sure, cultural factors, and also culture that we learned, but also just culture that we, in a sense, internalize because of the particularities of the environment we grew up in. Those massively influence the sort of inferences that our brain makes. We're using whatever information is at our disposal in our brain to try to make the best story we can about what's happening in any given moment.
Partly with the limitations of language or whatever, that's a whole other story though. One last question for me. On AI, Harari, who I know him, the historian who tried to write a whole history of the thing in 500 pages of the world. Anyway, he thinks we should outlaw fake people. He's talking about AI, and he's talking about people perhaps who take on the name, the form, everyone of some famous person or whatever else. He thinks that should be outlawed. And will there come a time when our perceptions will accept these as the real other, even, you know, so.
I think we're there for sure.
Okay. Yes.
These systems are in some ways like mind-blowingly sophisticated, in other ways very easily duped, as we can see from all these different kinds of visual illusions. And there are definitely pictures now where you would see the generated picture of a person that doesn't exist and a photograph it, and you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So that will be a part of our reality going forward, no doubt. Yeah.
You are an expert on the visual system, and you've recently become the director of the Cal lab on psychedelic science. Does that indicate that this psychedelic science lab will focus on the visual system? I'm not seeing a clear overlap. Can you help clarify that?
Of course, I'd love to. I mean, certainly psychedelics have very dramatic visual effects, and so for a researcher who's looking for an experimental manipulation, if you will, to be able to precisely change some aspect of the visual system in the brain and see the consequences for perception, it's a very well-defined knob you can turn, because we know at the biochemical level a lot about how psychedelics bind to particular receptors in the brain and then what the downstream consequences are. So as a tool for understanding the relationship between the mind and the brain and vision, they're very well suited. But there's a particular hypothesis that we're investigating, which is that psychedelics actually reduce the influence of our prior experiences on our sensory perception. And so you can create stimuli that are ambiguous. They can be perceived in a more kind of coherent way based on previous experiences we've had with visual objects, or you can equally well perceive the very same stimulus as just independent elements doing their own thing. And the reason this is relevant is that psychedelics have a lot of promise as treatment for various mental health disorders, and it's kind of, at first glance, suspicious that they're being claimed to be useful for addiction and PTSD and depression and anxiety. Like, it sounds like any snake oil is like it's good for everything, but it's not the case. It's actually very little evidence that it's useful for treating psychosis, for example, or personality disorders. And so what do these others have in common? It seems as though it's the system in our brain that uses our previous experiences to shape our reality in a more internal way about self-narratives and personal identity. So, for example, if you have severe depression, you start to tell stories about yourself that I'm the depressed person who's just never going to be successful in life, they're never going to be able to accomplish what I want to. That worsens the depression, and so there's this terrible feedback loop. And so here the previous information is maladaptive, and so the idea is that psychedelics reduce the influence of those narratives. Together with the right therapeutic environment, new kinds of information can be constructed that are healthier and more adaptive. And that's very intriguing and almost impossible to study neuroscientifically, because the concept of self and personal identity is just so, we really know very little about how it happens in the brain. So we're kind of taking the core of that theory and moving it to the visual system, where we really do have good constructs for sensory information and how perception is combines that with the previous information. And so the work we're doing is not with patients with a mental health disorder. It's basic mechanistic research in so-called healthy normal people, but very strong hypotheses coming out of the mental health literature about how psychedelics are going to affect visual processing at different stages of the neural pathways and biasing perception in a particular way. So that's the first study that we've got off the ground, is looking at that and hopefully getting some insights into at the brain level, how is it that psychedelic assisted therapy works? We really have no idea. So we're taking the visual system as a test bed that we know much more about than other parts of the brain, and sort of working from there.
Will you show the picture of your lab mates, please?
Yeah, sure.
Right? I am getting a hat. Before we give Dr. Silver a big final round of applause, let me remind you to save a little applause for Hot Monk for inviting us here, for each other being friends to each other and enjoying the wonders of science. And now maybe, how about a final, oh wait, I gotta remind you, 3 weeks from tonight, right here, Alex Filipenko, Universe of Universes, right here, it'll be a great talk. But speaking of great talks, how about another hand for Dr. Michael Silver? Thank you all.
I can personally vouch for Alex Filipenko as a speaker. He's unbelievable.
Good night all. Good night.